Alright, class, what we're going to be able to work with now is going to be Chapter 4. It's the second of the structural frame. It's entitled Structure and Restructuring, and what we're primarily going to work with is going to be the idea of what kind of dilemmas does one face during the structural frame? How do the configurations of an organization make for a positive or negatively aligned organization in terms of, again, structuring the pieces of an organization with the goal attainment that is key to the theory that we're using. What kind of generic issues are you going to face in restructuring? And this is universal to a multitude of different organizations, not germane to a single type or kind of organization. We're going to ask the question, why restructure? Ultimately, there's a multitude of different possibilities. We looked at in the last chapter that there's infinite ways in which an organization can be pieced together. Therefore, there's an infinite array of ways in which it can be changed. One of the questions we're going to ask ourselves is, well, so why would we restructure or why would we not restructure? They're also going to look at some case examples, but I don't really like the ones that are in the book, so we're not going to talk about those a ton. We're going to let you read over those. If you've got questions or you want to make those the source of your response paper, perhaps that would be a good idea for this, but I don't feel like they do a good job representing what I want to talk about whenever it comes to this chapter. So let's first deal with structural dilemmas. When I talk about structural dilemmas, it's problems that you face when you're trying to understand an organization through the structural lens. Structural dilemmas are problems that arise based on the structuring of an organization. So when we learned about differentiation and we learned about integration, remember that you want to remember differentiation as division of labor. So the symmetry between those D's are a good way of understanding and remembering them. And then integration as interconnectedness. So here we see on these two opposite poles the idea that you need to be different enough to be your own thing, but you also need to be integrated enough to make sure that those different things actually are meaningful to one another. Otherwise, you start to fall into a dangerous trap that comes with the idea of being either one, too different so that you're not really working together. You're just different pieces of an organization that really don't interact, that don't contribute to one another in a meaningful way, that don't help one another. You see this in failing organizations. I used sporting analogies with the human resource frame, but here, if you were looking at a sports team through the lens of a structural perspective, there are certain football teams, for example, that make the decision that they're going to have a general manager. At its heart, a general manager is the person who makes personnel decisions. Who's going to be the coach? Who are we going to draft? Which free agents are we going to pick up? The coach is the person who is on the field saying, these are the plays that we're going to run. These are the decisions we're going to make about who starts this particular week. There structurally can be a disconnect. Those are very different jobs, but they need to be deeply integrated. They either need to work with one another so that the coach can express to the general manager what things that they need in order to be successful, or in the case of some organizations, they've actually intertwined these two things and made the head coach and general manager the same position. So the person who's calling the plays on the field is also the one who's making the personnel decision. They rectified a structural dilemma of not having good communication between the two sides by simply making one and the same the two different jobs that needed to be fulfilled. That ties in to the idea of gaps versus overlaps. It's the idea of how much does your job bleed into my job, and if we're not differentiated enough, at what point does what I do supersede what you do? Go back to that authoritarian mindset of vertical coordination. Who has the end veto? who's going to make the decision? If we're at odds, who gets to be the one who makes that choice? There's a lot of overlap between parts of an organization, and it might not be clear who has that kind of power over one another. And so when there's gaps, think places where we're not integrated enough, or overlaps where we're extremely integrated, you're going to be able to see a dilemma in the power structure of an organization and the difficulties that they encounter when they're trying to figure out how to do simple or complex decision making. You're also going to look at a structural dilemma of underusage versus overload. Certain parts of your organization might be underutilized. They could do more for you, but they're not being given the opportunity. On the opposite end of that spectrum, you have certain people that have been so reliable, or a certain subset of your organization that's chose to take on so much of the workload that they're overworked, overburdened, and it's making their productivity suffer. If you were going to be a person who came in and diagnosed the problems of an organization, and you chose to look at it first through the structural perspective, and you were using this frame to diagnose difficulties, one of the number one things that you'd be able to do is say, how do these different parts of the organization function? Is anyone doing too much? In the case that they're doing too much, one of the dilemmas you have to make is, do you just add more people to lighten the load? Or perhaps, do you differentiate further and separate what they're doing into two different categories? If you have, for example, an organization taking that sporting analogy that we started with and inverting it instead, and you come onto your sports team and you say, right now, the coach is also the general manager, and there's not enough time and hours in the day to be able to create a playbook, to be able to run training camp, to be able to do the things that one needs to do to be a successful coach in the organization in which we're a part of, as well as do the scouting, make the connections, and make the decisions in the drafting process. You might go the complete opposite direction and say that we need to take some of that burden off of the individual who is doing both of those things and split that job back up again. Recognize that I've just described the same exact thing in two different ways, but in one I was trying to fulfill the goal of integration, and in one I was trying to fulfill the goal of analyzing what an overlooked part, an overworked part of an organization looks like, how to reconcile it, how to make it better for the people who are under that stressful, overworked load. You also encounter things like a lack of clarity and a lack of creativity. Think about the McDonald's versus Harvard examples. They were polar opposites in terms of the amount of creativity that's available to it. In the McDonald's example, creativity was the enemy. It was the problem. It was the thing we were trying to avoid. We wanted standardization. We wanted the double cheeseburger or the quarter pounder or the fries to taste the same, be prepared the same way, whether you got them in Tupelo, Mississippi, or whether you got them in Bauxite, Arkansas, or whether you got them in San Francisco, California, and so on and so forth. The complete opposite is true when you're looking for creativity. The room for creativity is the opportunity for you to instead be making choices about, I want to do things my own way, and there's two different correct ways to come to the same end. These two things are on polar opposites of one another. And the structure of the organization, the way things fit together, what's allowed and what people are allowed to do, are going to create some kind of tension between these two things. If you wanted to, and I'm going to be facetious, of course, but if you wanted to be your own radical burger making style and you thought that you could make the best quarter pounder with cheese possible by doing it slightly different, that's a problem within one structure. However, take a art class where you're all trying to do an abstract drawing of the same thing, but to try to make it creative, clever, engaging, audience specific, to draw somebody's eye into your work. creativity is going to be stressed there. And again, I use really extreme opposites to hopefully show you the concepts that I'm talking about that are somewhere in the center of those two dynamic opposites. Excessive autonomy and excessive interdependence go hand in hand with the idea of gaps and overlaps. You need to be able to have an integrated system, but at the same time, they need to have specific purposes. I'm not going to belabor that point or beat a dead horse, but I think one more thing that we really need to work on and talk about in this chapter that was an important primary point that needs some more teasing is twofold, and it comes right on bottom here, so we'll close this slide with these two ideas. Organizations need to be goal-oriented within a structured system. Within a structural frame, the number one thing that you're trying to see is everyone working to their maximum potential or optimization in the way that we're organized to achieve our particular goals? If we are not, or we could be having somebody else do something more or do something less and that would better achieve our goals, that's a way to want to restructure later. You'll notice that when we come back to this point, all of the reasons to restructure are to reconcile these dilemmas. The chapter is bookended nicely, and there's a great symmetry to the way that it talks about setting up a problem with the dilemmas and talking about the solution as potentially restructuring, which is kind of the thesis of this chapter. But you can also be too specifically focused on the goal so that you don't see the forest for the trees. If you understand that trite kind of ideology, it's that you've got blinders on. You're not paying attention to all the things that are necessary in order to achieve this goal. A traditional and trite way of thinking about this, but I think that will make it clear, is when you get so focused, let's say that you're a corporation, an organization that is specific to a particular field, and you sell goods and you produce services and you're trying to make money. If you're so focused on the bottom line and making the most money possible, sometimes you lose sight of customer satisfaction, of quality control, of keeping the best employees, and that goal focus sometimes actually deprives you of the ability to meet your goals in the best way possible. Now that bleeds a little bit over into the human resources frame, but from a structural perspective, that's what we're talking about being able to be goal focused, but not goal obsessed. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is the responsiveness of an organization. A lot of times the people who are on the ground floor, and we'll talk about this when we talk about Metzger's structure, and it's the idea that whenever you're on the front lines, you're the one who's selling the product, you're the one who's working with the public, you're the face of the organization, you get to read through the senses of sight, of observation, through hearing. You know why and how people are reacting in the way that they do. And a responsive organization is one that understands how those people get information like that to decision makers. Note that it's very rare that the people who are on the ground floor are the ones who are also making choices about how the organization writ large should be ran, particularly in larger organizations. So they can come to make irresponsible decisions because they don't know the information that they're trying to interact with. It's the boss or the head of the corporation or the head of the organization who's lost sight of what they're doing because they don't deal with the day-to-day operations of the organization enough. They've become too insulated or inculcated underneath a cocoon of checking out the supply lines, of making sure that things are run properly. It's easy to lose sight of the small things whenever you're so focused on the really big things that matter to an organization. There's a delicate balance to be had here, and sometimes I think that when we're talking about this, you don't want to fall into the fallacy, and we talked about the fallacies earlier, of imagining these as too extreme problems. They're things that you can overcome, and we're going to keep working forward under the ideology that each one of these dilemmas, though a problem within the structural frame, create an opportunity for change or to realign or to make things better. Let's get into some of the configurations. The thing, and I always confuse the name, it's Mintzberg. I always want to say Metzger, so forgive me for that earlier misstep. But the five pieces that we're going to talk about are the strategic apex, middle management, the operating core, the technostructure, and the support staff. And the strategic apex is at the top of the hierarchy. They're the people who are making the decisions about how the organization will go forward. CEOs, CFOs, the owner operator of the business is the person who is at the strategic apex. They're the ones who are making choices about how programs are going to be enacted, how rules are going to be made, and the middle management provides a bridge. That bridge between the strategic apex and the operating core is what middle management does. I'll go back to our favorite Burger King example for a moment, and they're the ones that are shift managers. They're the ones that are the store managers. They're the ones that are making decisions for the individual piece of that greater whole of an organization, but they're the ones that just try to keep the train on the track, so to speak. They're the ones that implement the edicts or the commands or the rules of the strategic apex and try to make sure that everything's going according to plan. They're also the ones that hold people accountable whenever missteps happen, whenever rules are broken. The operating core is interesting because the operating core is the grunt force. They're the ones that, if you're talking about a apparel sales place or anywhere in which you would work in retail and you would make a commission of some sort, they're the salespeople that are on the floor. They're the ones that are trying to sell you the good in question that this particular business or organization sells. That operating core is the group of people that make things happen within an organization. And they're really the grunt level that, whenever I talked about earlier about the idea of being unresponsive, here what we're going to talk about is the operating core being the ones that you really need to have more and more upward communicative ability between this and the strategic apex in order to have a high functioning structural organization. Now, the chapter goes in to really complicated versions of what these organizations can look like and some of the configurations. I'm not going to go over them in tremendous detail, except insofar as to say that the simple structure is one that, as you continue to go forward, shows that there's pieces of these other structures within the grander structure. If you think about it as an umbrella type system, or I guess a way that you might think about it is when you're on the internet and you're following hyperlinks and it creates a tree where if you back click once, you get to hear. If you back click another time, you get to hear. And simply put, you're moving backwards to its simplest components. When you're talking about structural configurations, a simple structure has someone at the helm and at the top who's able to make decisions, and those decisions are ultimately going to be directed immediately to the core. This simple structure can't be used in too big of an organization because you're missing some of the components that you need in order to be successful. There's not a lot of room for middle management here. I think it's represented by this small bottleneck. The strategic apex has a lot of control and influence, and it's a direct kind of control and influence. This is much more representative of a vertical coordination that we talk about. If you can imagine a campaign that's being run for political office on a very small scale, we're not talking about running for president, we're not talking about running for senate, we're not talking about even running for a big elected office within the state. I'm talking about maybe the local comptroller. I'm talking about running for a city official. Small governance can use a simple structure for its campaign because you might have 10 people on staff, and therefore the strategic apex and the connection to them is really literal. You have the opportunity to have that kind of communication back and forth that lets them make choices about how best to sell their candidate to move the campaign forward, and it can be done in a simple structure. Mechanical or machine bureaucracy, but a mechanical bureaucracy is the idea that there are pieces that can be interchanged with one another and you will lose nothing. One of the things about the dilemmas that we face when we talk about the structural frame, one of its weaknesses and one of its greatest weaknesses is the idea that it sees people as a set of skills rather than an individual. So if you and I both graduated and we both had the same GPA and we were both in the same major, we are equal in the eyes of the structural frame. We could be plugged in and we could both do the same job. It automatizes people and it neutralizes the human capacity for it. And I think that that's highlighted best in Bowman and Deal, the authors of your textbooks. Vision here of how the structures of an organization can be configured. Mitzberg does a really good job of giving you alternative visions for how organizations can be set up. But at the same time, what it's doing for you is it's opening up the lens that as you grow bigger or as your goals change, you're going to need to fit a different form in order to be able to achieve those goals. Now, I've skipped over these intentionally because I use these as a perception or reading check from the book. There's certain things that are on the tests that are integrated into the lectures. There's certain things that I'm hoping to be able to integrate from the response and replies that are going to go on the discussion board. But there's also going to be reading checks. And this has definitions in it. And this has really specific material about how these pieces work and how they all fit together. So I didn't want to do a lot of work on this section because I want to make sure that you're reading sections like this very closely. I won't always broadcast for you things like that whenever I've kind of got a perception check against the book in there. But for this first unit that we're working on, I want to be upfront with the way that I'm trying to approach studying. I want to be upfront with how I'm trying to approach how the instructional part of this class goes forward. I enrich the textbook. You're supposed to make sure that you read every page that's been assigned to you. The only way that I can be sure that you're actually doing the reading in addition to the lectures is to not always cover all of the material, but to highlight the important things, to draw out, to tease out special information, and to make what we talk about in the lectures more informative than that which is in the textbook. So I'm enriching and adding value to that to which you're learning. But I really want to make sure that you're reading, and so whenever you come across this part of the textbook, please pay special attention. It's also probably a nice way for me to make sure, is everybody listening to the lectures? You might not have known that I forecasted this if you weren't listening. So in the same way that I would reward attendance in a traditional face-to-face class, this is a nice way of saying I appreciate you not only paying attention to the lectures but keeping up with the reading, and we'll have some Easter eggs, so to speak, hidden throughout these lectures like this. So the web of inclusion. The web of inclusion is, to me, a really interesting theory and idea. And what it does is it imagines leadership as central rather than hierarchical. It's a lateral method of coordination. If we talked a lot about vertical, power related hierarchies, here what we're talking about is the boss who is the master of the carnival. If you've ever imagined or saw, it happened a lot in old cartoons, but it was an old vaudevillian trick of being able to keep plates on poles. And, somebody could keep 4 or 5 plates spinning all at once. And it was a matter of making sure that as you spun each plate, you kept in your mind the rotation of the plate so that none stopped spinning and fell to the ground and broke. What it was a test of this person's agility and the ability to keep in their mind what they'd done last. It's a method of thinking of management as keeping fires out before they become big, terrible, dangerous flames. It's putting them out when they're small. Leadership is centrally located rather than top-down management. The web that spirals out is an opportunity for a network of interconnection, is what the authors talk about. And what it is it means that the organizational structure is bound together by the connection that the leader is able to put between them. Imagine a man named Rodney. He is the leader of this relatively medium-sized business. It's a statewide business. You see Rodney from day to day. You see him come through on a given week. He's at each of the plants that he takes part in. He's not just somebody who passed down a rule, but he's somebody who talks to you about the rule. Now, there'll become a time whenever the business is too large to have this happen. This vision of how an organization can function is a really interesting one. It allows for the idea of the leader to be directly connected with people on the ground. If we talked about meetings being really important and about how the ground level is able to give responsive feedback, in the web of inclusion, that feedback is that to which the boss or the person in control really thrives on. They feed on getting that information, asking middle management and asking the operating core, how are things going? What are we doing? What's selling? How's it working? An example of this is a department store that is trying to move on getting more people to open credit lines with them. So they've got a credit card, and a boss is coming from town to town, store to store, and asking people, how many credit cards are we opening per day? How many do you open on a given shift? What's been effective for you? What's worked? And they're sharing the good word of what has worked in one place with another place. And that shows the interconnectiveness and the dependence upon other places in order to improve the quality of that goal of achieving more credit cards being opened piece by piece, place by place, and in an open-ended discussion. So, okay, what are some of the generic issues for restructuring in any organization, not necessarily in a specific subset of organizations? At its most theoretical level, one of the difficulties is the strategic apex. There's always a push from those in control to have more control. There's a certain desire in human beings to be able to control and be around everywhere and thinking that they've got a great and brilliant idea in order to move the organization forward if you'll just do exactly what they say. It's about control, it's about power, it pushes for more alignment and centralization. That's one way. So that's a top-down problem that you can face, is the desire for the people who have control to have more control. There's also a push from the middle that can become a problem with the way that we've talked about structure in this particular rigid terminology that we're using. Middle managers want their own autonomy. They want to be able to run their own ship. If you think about divisions of the army, you have generals and you have the strategic apex at the top who are making decisions about what we're going to do, where we're going to attack, and who the enemy is. Then you've got middle management, who are the people who run a particular division, brigade, group, and they're going to be the one who are telling the grunt troops on the ground in order what to do. Well, some of those middle managers want more power. They say, I'm right here, I can see this. If I could coordinate this group, they would be able to perform better. And so that creates pressure from the middle. You can read the other two, but for me, another pressure was from the bottom up. When the operating core feels disempowered and they don't have the opportunity to either thrive, to better themselves, to make their situation better. Another issue with restructuring is that the people who are doing the actual operating of the organization want to have it changed so that it feels like what they're doing has more meaning. Remember that organizations give meaning to people, and they provide people with not only the opportunity to express themselves, but to support themselves, to create goods and services, to give purpose to a lot of that to which we take for granted. And so, from the bottom up, in the same way that the strategic apex can thirst for power, the thirst for power goes both ways. They want more autonomy. They want to be able to have more sway and say in what goes on. And so those are generic issues that happen in restructuring, so that there's pressure from all these different angles in order to better oneself. So you might be asking yourself, okay, Daryl, I've listened to absolutely everything that you've said. I agree with you about the way that you can potentially restructure. I have heard about some of the dilemmas that we've faced, and I've thought about the goal orientation and why we might change for a certain goal orientation. So why restructure? There's certain things that you can think about that are reasons to immediately restructure. And if you don't restructure, you potentially die as an organization. I like to talk about technology changes as a great option. Why do you have a landline? The answer is a lot of people don't. It used to be taken for granted that no more than 20, 25 years ago, everybody had a telephone in their house. They paid a phone bill. They had long distance charges on that phone bill. And after the advent of the cellular telephone, a technology change, it became less and less important to be able to have a landline telephone because you carried your phone with you and you had cellular reception. And if you were already going to have to pay for a cellular plan, then the desire to pay for a land-based line is relatively null and void. So what did organizations that provide landline-based technology do? They typically try to package it or bundle it together with your internet, with your satellite, with your cable, with other services that you're already getting. They say, hey, would you like this as an add-on? Something that was formerly taken for granted as something that every house needed and everyone used, now is an add-on package. Let's talk about another technological change and environmental shift kind of combined into one. What happened to good old Blockbuster Video? Whenever I was a younger man, I remember going to Blockbuster Video or video rental places all the time, not only to rent movies, but also to rent video games and to be able to have an opportunity to see those things as soon as they came out to home video. Well, streaming came and more or less gutted the ability of those businesses or organizations. Their goal no longer was the same. If they were trying to provide content to a consumer that was thirsty to watch movies and see shows, what they got instead was an opportunity to do so that was faster, easier, and provided more choices and was cheaper. And this category of things stopped being necessary. The goal that you were trying to achieve was satisfied better elsewhere. And so that technology and environmental shift in that organization structure meant that you went by the wayside because there was no reason to buy those goods or services anymore. There's also times whenever leadership changes. Whenever we think about leadership changes, there are things called transformative leaders. This is why I think that it's interesting. Remember that at the very beginning when we talked in chapter 1 and we talked in chapter 2, multi-perspectival thought processes about these frames are important. You'll never just deal with one frame. It's about how each frame benefits you in thinking about the potential organization. Human resources and the human resources frame blends over here. Certain transformative leaders are so valuable to their collective that when they're gone and when they're not available anymore, the entire organization changes. You can look at it from a countrywide perspective. Whenever great leaders in time, militarily or politically, have passed away or have lived out their term in office and are no longer available, the entire landscape of that organization changes. And this happens, and people need to restructure. We can't do what Alexander the Great did because we don't have Alexander the Great to do so for us anymore. We need to be able to subsume some of the roles, responsibilities, and tasks in a different structure. More people need to step up. If you've ever heard that within an organization or group when they say, well, Sally is no longer going to be available to lead us. And we've all followed Sally for 30 years. She's been a spectacular CEO of this organization. But without her guidance and her wisdom, we're going to need all of us to take on a little bit more responsibility. We're all going to need to do X, Y, and Z better in order to account for that loss. That's a reason why restructuring is necessary. Sometimes an environmental change occurs based on leadership. You don't have the same people available, and when you don't, you need to account for that. So, in conclusion, what have we talked about in this lesson? We've learned about structural dilemmas and how they provide both an opportunity and a way for diagnosing potential problems within an organization. We've talked about some of the structural configurations with more work to be done by you, of course. We've talked about how changes in environment and pressures that go from environmental shifts to technology changes to leadership alteration provide opportunities for restructuring, and how that restructuring can make your organization better fit, better able to meet its goals, and when those goals change, to be able to change and transition with those goal changes. If I were going to write papers for a response to this chapter, I think I'd first talk about the structural orientations from Mintzberg. I didn't talk about them. That's a very fertile ground. A lot of written material, a lot to be talked about there. So that would probably be one place that I'd data mine really quickly. I'd be interested to hear responses that talked about how environmental pressures have changed organizations. Do a case study. Pick something where a technology shift or where an environmental shift or a leadership change has radically altered a potential organization, and discuss to test whether these theories are true or false. Did the things that Bowman and Deal predict to happen occur? Is it right? That's an easy case study to think about whenever you're thinking about these response papers. And a third avenue that I think I talk about is, were some of the dilemmas more meaningful? Can you give examples for all of the dilemmas? Were some of them meaningless? Did they not make as much sense given both the lecture discussion that we've just had and the chapter material? There's comparison to be had there, and I think that might provide for a fruitful response. As always, I welcome you to email me or contact me in any way if you're interested in both a conversation or you have any questions. I'm available, and as always, I hope that you are enjoying these lectures and will be able to write fruitful responses. Take care, and we'll close up the structural frame with Chapter 5 in the next lesson. Take care.